I was standing stiffly in that quiet, tension-filled courtroom, my fingers digging into the cold edge of the oak table in front of me. My ex-husband's new wife, Brittany Chase, suddenly pointed her manicured finger straight at me like I was a criminal on trial, and in a voice that cut across the room said, "She's a gold digger." She only married him for the money. Her words didn't shock me, not really. Brittany had never hidden her disdain for me, even back when Mark and I were still married. She'd always acted like I was some stain from his past that refused to wash out. But hearing it spoken aloud so boldly in front of Judge Whitaker, the attorneys, the court reporter, and most painfully in front of my daughter Emma, it stung more than I imagined it would. I felt this tight burn rising in my chest like a slow flame crawling toward my throat. But I held my posture. I didn't cry, didn't recoil, didn't even blink. I had learned how to absorb attacks like these, how to armor myself in silence. Then came the next blow. Mark's lawyer, Mr. Trent Ellis, leaned forward from his seat like a seasoned actor hitting his dramatic mark. His voice was firm, the kind that oozed calculated calm. "There's a distinct financial motive here, Your Honor," he declared. Ms. Morgan profited substantially from Mr. Morgan's income throughout their marriage. Her present financial requests seemed to echo that same pattern. He said it all so smoothly, like he was reading from a well-rehearsed script. And the way he emphasized Ms. Morgan like I was just another stranger filing a claim cut deeper than I'd expected. As if I hadn't spent over a decade raising Emma, while Mark jetted around the country on business junkets dressed up as leadership retreats. As if I hadn't scraped together rent money from my waitress tips during the first few years of our marriage, while he was still figuring himself out. Still, I didn't rise to defend myself. Instead, I turned slightly and let my eyes fall on Emma. She was 13, perched quietly on the bench just behind me. Her hands clenched so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. She looked so small sitting there in her navy coat, her backpack resting at her feet. But her gaze. Her eyes were fierce, locked in with laser focus on what was unfolding. And then just when I thought I had control of the room's narrative, she stood up. "Mom," she said clearly, her voice stronger than I had ever heard it, slicing through the murmurs like a bell. "Should I tell them what we found in Dad's bank records?" Every movement in the courtroom halted in an instant. Heads turned, including Judge Whitaker's. Even the court reporter stopped mid-keystroke. Trent Ellis froze, his smirk evaporating as he slowly sat back down with a wary glance around the room. I hadn't expected her to say a word. I never wanted her to. I had told her to stay silent, to let the grown-ups sort through the mess. I thought I was shielding her from the worst of it. But Emma wasn't having it. She had watched the lies build up around us, brick by brick, and now she was ready to tear them down. She wasn't about to let anyone smear her mother's name, not if she had anything to say about it. And in that single moment, the tide in that courtroom shifted. Everything before the whispered judgments, the carefully stacked accusations, the crushing weight of trying to rebuild from nothing fell into the background. There are moments like that, quiet revolutions hidden in ordinary rooms. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever found yourself fighting to be seen, to be heard, or simply to hold on to your truth, consider supporting our journey by liking this video, sharing it with someone who might need it, and subscribing to the channel. Your voice, your presence here helps stories like mine reach the people who need them most. After the divorce, life no longer felt like life. It felt like trespassing in someone else's existence. Every morning I awoke in an unfamiliar silence, surrounded by beige walls that echoed nothing of me, nothing of who I had been. The furniture wasn't mine. The mail no longer bore my married name. I had become Rachel Morgan again, not by choice, but by abandonment, by erasure. Once I had been Mrs. Morgan, a partner in what I believed was a shared dream. Now I was simply the woman who'd been discarded, quietly replaced like a worn-out coat returned to the back of a closet. People underestimate how swiftly a life can come undone. One minute you're sharing bills, planning holidays, discussing school projects, and the next, you're watching your husband pack his things with surgical detachment, as if your history together had been a mistake he was correcting. Mark didn't just leave me, he replaced me. Replaced my name, my title, my role, and built a glossy new life as though mine had merely been a prototype. We had been married for 14 years. We met at the University of North Carolina, Mia Jr. with ink-stained hands and lesson plans on my mind, and Mark a business major with 2 white teeth and dreams bigger than his student loans. He was the type of man who could sell anyone on anything, including the future. I believed him when he said we'd build something real. I believed in him so deeply that when he lost his internship, I took on double shifts at the diner off campus to cover his tuition and groceries. I believed in him enough to pause my own education when we found out I was pregnant. That was the beginning of Emma, my bright, fire-eyed girl, the axis around which my entire world would spin. While Mark began his climb up the corporate mountain, I stayed behind, anchoring the home crafting routines out of chaos, folding his shirts, packing lunches, singing lullabies, and memorizing the quiet language of motherhood. I thought that made me his equal. I thought it earned me a place at the table. But somewhere along the way, success carved something cold and unfamiliar into him. Or maybe it didn't change him at all. Maybe it merely gave him the room to reveal who he had always been beneath the charm. By the time Emma turned 10, Mark had started disappearing. First it was the late nights, then the weekends, then entire holidays spent alone in hotel suites under the guise of business. The distance between us was not a drift, it was deliberate, it was plotted. Eventually I discovered what I hadn't wanted to see: a stream of hidden payments monthly, sometimes bi-monthly, being sent to a woman named Vanessa Reed. She had been in his life far longer than Brittany, the one who now bore the title of wife like it came with a crown. When I confronted him, there was no denial, no apology, just a sneer and the cruelest words I'd ever heard. "You've had it easy for years. You should be grateful." Grateful for being sidelined, for being faithful while he laid the groundwork for another life in the shadows. When he finally left, he didn't just walk out the door, he took the locks with him. The bank account, the insurance, the house, even the car. I was left scrapping for the slivers, fighting tooth and nail just to hold on to a modest alimony and full custody of our daughter. Mark contested everything, always under the pretense that I was trying to bleed him dry, even as he decorated his new designer kitchen with Brittany, the woman who wore stilettos to court and always seemed freshly plucked from a lifestyle magazine. She had no shortage of opinions on my parenting, my finances, my wardrobe. I never replied, never engaged, but she made sure her judgments echoed in my voicemail. One message laced with venom had etched itself into my mind. "Women like you are why men stop believing in love." I saved it. I didn't know why. Maybe to remind myself I wasn't imagining the cruelty. Still, I stayed focused on Emma. We had our own rhythm, our own small sanctuary, an apartment just 2 blocks from her school. I found work tutoring at first, then was lucky enough to land a teaching job with a 3rd-grade class that reminded me why I loved what I once gave up. It wasn't much, but it was enough. We made dinners from scratch. We graded papers together. Weekends were for pancakes, sitcoms, and laughter that didn't cost a dime. It was simple, it was real. And then the letter came. Mark was contesting our custody agreement. He wanted joint custody not out of fatherly devotion, but because it would slash his child support payments in half. His attorney claimed there were concerns about Emma's financial stability. Not about my parenting, never that, just the money. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed staring at the letter like it had sucked the air out of the room. I wasn't furious. I was exhausted. Tired of constantly having to justify my worth to people who had never once paused to see what I'd given up. That night, Emma found me silently crying in the dark. She didn't ask questions. She just sat beside me, wrapped her small hand around mine, and whispered, "You don't have to fight him alone, Mom. I know things. I see things." I didn't ask what she meant. I just pulled her close and murmured, "You're still a kid, Em. This shouldn't be your burden." But in her mind, she was already more than a kid. She was a witness, and she had been paying close attention for years. The courthouse the next morning felt like walking into a glacier. Not cold in temperature, but in atmosphere. The emotional frost clung to everything: silent judgments, hushed alliances, invisible lines drawn across the floor. I wore my best coat, the one with the velvet trim I'd saved for serious occasions, but it couldn't shield me from the chill in the room. Mark sat across from me, expression unreadable, arms folded like a man under siege. Brittany was beside him in heels that clicked against the tile with every cross of her leg. She was glued to her phone, her perfectly manicured nails, tapping a rhythm that cut through the murmur of legal whispers and rustling papers. I sat with my lawyer, Lauren Adams, a fierce young woman with soft eyes and a spine made of steel, though even she seemed wary today. Mark's legal team had filed a motion that could change everything. If the judge ruled that Emma's environment with me was financially insufficient, I could lose more than support. I could lose primary custody. My daughter's life would be split down the middle, her routines uprooted, her voice muted. I glanced at her in the gallery. Emma had insisted on being there. I'd begged her to stay home to avoid the mess, but she had simply said, "If they're going to talk about my life, I deserve to be in the room." I couldn't argue with that. She had every right to bear witness. The hearing began quietly. Judge Alan Whitaker sat stone-faced as he leafed through our file, his expression giving away nothing. Then Trent Ellis stood. Mark's lawyer treated the room like a courtroom theater pacing with intention, his voice low, precise, persuasive. "Your Honor," he began, "this isn't about limiting a mother's role in her child's life. It's about ensuring the child's best interest." The prosecution was relentless. Ms. Morgan Trent Ellis began, his voice as smooth as a sales pitch, is currently working only part-time and residing in a rental property. She lacks a health insurance plan and relies on inconsistent income. He didn't spare me a glance as he spoke, didn't acknowledge me as a person. I was merely an exhibit, in his argument an abstract figure scribbled onto a legal pad, a liability in someone else's financial report. Mr. Morgan, on the other hand, he continued, turning slightly toward the bench, has the structure and stability necessary to provide a more secure future for Emma. I sat frozen in my chair, the fabric of my blouse clinging slightly to my skin from the courtroom heat, though I felt a coldness rise from somewhere deeper, somewhere hollowed out by repetition, by shame. And then came the deliberate theatricality. Brittany stood, her heels clicking sharply against the floor like punctuation marks. She didn't have to speak, but she asked to one of those calculated gestures meant to look spontaneous. Judge Whitaker, perhaps already charmed by her polish, gave her the floor. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, her expression calm and unreadable, and launched into the same rehearsed venom she always managed to deliver with a smile. "She married Mark for the money," Brittany said with a tilt of her head. "He supported her lifestyle, her house, her vacations, everything. And now she's milking him through child support and alimony." My pulse thudded in my ears. I kept my face still, a mask I'd worn so often it had become a second skin. I knew the rules: don't cry or you'll look unstable. Don't get angry or you'll look bitter. Celeste's gaze flicked toward the judge. "I'm not saying she's a bad mother," she added, "but she's financially motivated. And that matters." As if on cue, Trent Ellis stepped back in, nodding solemnly. "Your Honor," he intoned, "we contend that Ms. Morgan's financial intentions have colored her decisions throughout the marriage and persist post-divorce. This is not an issue of shared parenting. This is about fairness, responsibility." My lungs felt tight, my breath shallow. I had kept quiet through betrayal, through lonely dinners with Emma asking where Dad had gone, through skipped meals and mounting bills and dignity scraped from corners. But now, as they reshaped my life into a courtroom caricature, I felt the slow, creeping terror of being erased. I turned to look at Emma. Her small fists were clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed not on her father, not on Brittany, but directly on the judge. She sat upright, silent and simmering. I thought that was it, that the court would proceed to the next phase. But then, like a thunderclap breaking an uneasy sky, Emma stood. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. All heads turned. Judge Whitaker's brows lifted. "May I speak?" she asked. The judge turned to me. I nodded slowly, my throat too tight for words. Emma stepped forward, her chin high, her frame fragile, but steady. "I just have one question," she said, turning to face me. "Mom, should I tell them what we found in Dad's bank statements?" Gasps broke out, scattered and stunned. Trent Ellis stiffened. Brittany's mouth went tight. Mark shifted sharply in his seat, the mask of composure cracking around the edges. Emma looked at me, not with fear or uncertainty, but with a kind of quiet resignation, as if she had carried the truth for so long it had finally outgrown its cage. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She had already made her choice. The air changed. Judge Whitaker regarded her carefully. "This is highly irregular," he said, but I'll allow it. Go ahead. Emma nodded once, then inhaled deeply. A few months ago, she began, I was at Dad's house. He logged into his bank account to buy me some math software, but he forgot to log out. After he left the room, I saw something strange, payments going out regularly to someone named Vanessa Reed. Mark flinched as if struck. Brittany's eyes narrowed. Emma continued, her voice unwavering. They weren't small payments, sometimes twice a month, thousands of dollars. I didn't say anything at the time, but later I told Mom. She said it wasn't my problem, that I didn't have to get involved. She turned briefly toward me, but I remembered. I remembered everything. Vanessa wasn't just some friend. I saw them together before the divorce. At a restaurant once, laughing. Dad told me not to mention it. The courtroom was deathly quiet. Even the judge seemed stunned. Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out an envelope. She held it carefully like it was made of glass. We printed the statements, just in case. Lauren, my attorney, turned to me in astonishment. She hadn't seen the documents before. I hadn't planned to use them. I didn't want to win that way. But Emma had reached a different conclusion. She had watched them lie about me for too long. Lauren stood, took the envelope, and approached the bench. Your Honor, I was unaware of this material, but it speaks directly to the question of financial motive. Judge Whitaker opened the envelope and began flipping through the statements. The room was silent but tense, charged with the weight of every lie that now stood naked in the light. Trent Ellis stood slowly. Your Honor, we object this evidence was obtained without consent. Judge Whitaker didn't look up. She accessed the account from her father's home with the screen still open. This isn't a breach. I'll rule on admissibility later. But for now, I've seen enough. Mark's face darkened. Brittany stared dead ahead, her jaw locked tight as if clenching her teeth could somehow hold back the flood of realization. I watched her eyes dull, her mind visibly racing, replaying every story Mark had fed her, every line she'd accepted as truth. But that was no longer my burden to carry. I had nothing left to prove to her. The gravity in the room had shifted. I was no longer the villain in their carefully curated narrative. I was no longer the woman they labeled with slurs designed to diminish me. The courtroom, once a chamber of scrutiny, had become a quiet arena of reckoning. I rose from my seat, my knees trembling, not with fear but release, and crossed the short distance to Emma. She had returned to her place behind the plaintiff's table, her shoulders squared, but her hands trembling faintly. I wrapped my arms around her gently, protectively. You didn't have to do that, I murmured, my voice barely audible. I wanted to, she whispered back. You always protect me. I thought maybe it was time I did the same. I pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, lavender, and something like honey. For the first time in what felt like forever, I no longer felt like I was fighting alone. At the bench, Judge Whitaker flipped through the bank statements methodically, the crisp shuffle of each page louder than footsteps in a tomb. No one dared interrupt. Not Ellis, who had once strutted the courtroom like a stage. Not Mark, who now sat hunched over his shoulders, curled inward like a man shrinking under the weight of his own falsehoods. Mr. Morgan, the judge finally said, lifting his gaze, his voice mild but laced with steel. Can you explain these recurring transactions to Ms. Vanessa Reed? Mark cleared his throat and attempted a smile that wilted on his face. She was an old friend, he said, a weak shrug barely accompanying the words. She was going through a rough patch. I was helping her. The judge raised an eyebrow, flipping to another page. A rough patch that spanned 3 years and totaled over $60,000. Mark shifted in his chair, fingers drumming nervously on the polished wood. They weren't all gifts. Some were reimbursements. To someone not related to you, not documented on your taxes, and absent from your financial disclosures. The judge replied, his voice now measured, but with an unmistakable weight. You claimed financial hardship under oath, Mr. Morgan. You painted Ms. Morgan as fiscally irresponsible while concealing tens of thousands in private transfers. I sat still, my hands folded tightly in my lap. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. There was nothing triumphant in watching him shrink, only a kind of vindicated sadness. He had built his castle on secrets, and now they were cracking beneath him. Brittany didn't speak. Her gaze was anchored to the floor, her expression unreadable. Ellis, ever the professional, made a final attempt to redirect. Your Honor, Even if these transactions fall outside the purview of the original motion, they do not negate our central claim. But Judge Whitaker was already shaking his head. They severely damage your credibility. You accused Ms. Morgan of exploitation while your client was quietly financing another relationship. That alters the entire context of this case. Silence followed thick and consuming. Lauren glanced at me and gave a subtle nod. I knew what it meant. This wasn't just about child support anymore. The judge was reevaluating everything. Suddenly, Brittany stood. Her movement was sharp, abrupt. She turned to Mark, her voice low but lethal. You told me she was draining you, that you couldn't afford to support 2 homes. Brittany, not now, Mark muttered, reaching for her arm. She jerked away. No, this is exactly the time. You brought me into this circus. You dragged Emma into it. And why to hide the fact that you've been lying to both of us? Without another word, she turned and marched from the courtroom. Mark didn't follow. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, folding his hands. This case was brought to question Ms. Morgan's fitness and financial responsibility, based on the evidence presented that concern is entirely unfounded. He paused, letting the silence do its work. I see a pattern of consistency, restraint, and integrity in Ms. Morgan's actions. Mr. Morgan, by contrast, has demonstrated a troubling lack of transparency. My chest tightened, not in fear this time, but with something else. Something warmer. Primary custody, the judge continued, will remain with Ms. Morgan. Child support shall remain unchanged. In addition, this court recommends a full financial audit of Mr. Morgan's assets to assess potential further legal implications. I exhaled long and slow. Not relief, something deeper. Vindication. I no longer needed to explain who I was. Emma's fingers slipped into mine, squeezing gently. She didn't need to speak. Her posture, her steady gaze told me she understood the weight of what had happened. As we left the courtroom, the very people who had once whispered behind cupped hands now moved aside for us. Some averted their eyes. Others looked with a hesitant kind of respect, or maybe remorse. Lauren caught my arm before leaving. You didn't just win, Rachel, you revealed the truth. You reminded them who you are. I nodded, but my attention was already on Emma. She had always known who I was. I just wanted her to see it in me the way I saw it in her. We climbed into the car in silence. I started the engine, but neither of us reached for the radio. Emma stared out the window, chewing the edge of her sleeve like she used to when she was little and worried. You did something incredibly brave today, I said, my voice quiet. But I need to ask, are you okay? She nodded. Yeah, I just didn't think it would feel so heavy afterward. I reached over, held her hand. That's because truth is heavy. But you carried it with strength. She turned back to the window. I didn't do it for me. I know, I said, but today you showed them who you are. And that means more than anything they've ever said about me. We returned home to our imperfect haven. The walls still needed paint. The faucet still moaned when turned the wrong way. But it was ours, and it had never felt more sacred. That night after dinner, I tucked Emma into bed. She flipped through one of her old comics, the one with the frayed spine she'd read more times than I could count. I brushed a strand of hair from her face and kissed her forehead. Mom, she asked, I know you didn't want me to speak in court. Were you mad? I hesitated, then smiled. No, I was scared they'd twist it. But you weren't reckless. You were right. She smiled back. I just didn't want them to lie about you anymore. You're not who they said you were. I squeezed her hand. Neither are you. After she drifted off, I sat alone in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound. I opened the folder I'd kept hidden for so long, the records, the receipts, the pieces of truth Mark never thought I'd preserve. I hadn't held on to them out of vengeance. I'd done it out of instinct, out of some deep-rooted desire to be ready. There had been a time I thought dignity meant silence, that if I just stayed quiet, peace would follow. But silence only protects you when those around you respect it. In that courtroom, I had learned something I had been afraid to face. I wasn't quiet anymore, neither was my daughter. I no longer wondered what might become of Mark and Brittany. Whether their relationship would unravel in the privacy of whispered accusations or persist beneath the strain of unspoken truths was irrelevant to me. I didn't need their house to fall to feel that mine had been rebuilt. Their betrayal had once cast a shadow over my life, but now their cruelty no longer held dominion over my peace. I walked out of that courtroom, not with vengeance smoldering in my chest, but with something far more enduring clarity. They had called me a gold digger not because it was true, but because it was easier than confronting their own cowardice, their own deceit. They tried to distill a lifetime of sacrifice and resilience into a spreadsheet, into legal jargon and courtroom whispers. But what they didn't understand, what they never truly saw, was that the power never belonged to them. It belonged to me. The woman who didn't break when everything was stripped away. The mother whose child knew her truth before the world ever caught up. I no longer sought justice as if it was something to chase. I stood in it finally. When I returned to work, a few colleagues asked about the hearing in hushed tones over coffee and emails. I offered a quiet smile and simply said, "It's been settled." I didn't elaborate. I didn't mention the tension so thick it seemed to pulse in the air, or the way Emma's voice had cracked open the silence like sunlight through glass. That moment belonged to us. It wasn't fodder for gossip or lunchtime curiosity. It was a part of our story now, etched into the marrow of our lives, ours to hold, ours to protect. The next morning, Emma moved through our small apartment with a confidence that was both new and ancient. She seemed taller, like something invisible had straightened in her spine overnight. She pulled her hoodie over her head, slung her backpack over one shoulder, and met my eyes with a quiet smile. Not the nervous kind, but the kind that said, "I know who I am now." "Ready?" I asked as I handed her lunch. "Always," she said, and so was I. I was never a gold digger. I was never the woman they tried to rewrite. I was a mother, a fighter, a survivor, and they would never forget the day my daughter reminded them of the truth. There are stories that unfold in courtrooms, and then there are the ones that live beyond transcripts and rulings. Stories like ours, rooted in heartache but blooming with grit. If something in our journey resonated with you, if you've ever felt silenced, misunderstood, or judged through someone else's lens, I hope you carry this truth with you. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. Sometimes it takes just one brave voice like my daughter's to shift the entire narrative. If our story moved, you please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who may need the reminder, and leave a comment. I read every single one. And if you want more stories that speak to the real, raw heart of human experience, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Because moments like this, where truth rises and finds its voice, deserve to be seen. Thank you for being here. Your presence, your empathy, and your story matter more than you know.